In the earliest days of video game music, you had games such as Space Invaders, which was the first video game to have a soundtrack, if you even want to call it that. Then, at the start of the next decade, came Pac-Man. Still one of the most culturally relevant games, and it had this iconic little tune. Not long after that, we'd get plenty of other great games with iconic soundtracks, like Donkey Kong and Super Mario Bros. In 1985, arguably the most iconic video game soundtrack ever. While all of these games have withstood the test of time and paved the way for music and games, today we're talking about one of the most recognized names in video game composing. Sometimes referred to as the Mozart of gaming or the John Williams of gaming, let's talk about veteran Final Fantasy composer Nobuo Uematsu and how he defined several generations of Final Fantasy music, with a slight emphasis on Final Fantasy VII to celebrate Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Nobuo Uematsu was born on March 21, 1959 in Kochi Prefecture on the island of Shikoku, Japan, a fairly isolated and peaceful place with mountains and rivers. He claimed that Kochi was a strange and supernatural place, and that feeling of mysticism would influence his later work. A couple of supernatural events he recalls were seeing strange figures from the corner of his eye, floating above his bed, and being dragged around his room by his legs in the middle of the night. At the young age of 10, Uematsu heard the Vienna Boys Choir perform. He said, "It really was a formative moment in my life. It was the first time I got a taste of how moving music can be." He said it was an experience he wanted to recreate in his own way, a goal he's actually still chasing to this day. Uematsu is a self-taught musician. His first memory of trying to learn music was when he was about 11 or 12. While at his grandparents' house, he borrowed a guitar they had. He'd bring it home and study music sheets he found in a magazine. He wasn't sure how to read the sheet, but spent time examining all the letters and dots, and started to get the feel for music composition. He also had an older sister who played piano, and he'd take her sheets and translate them to play on the guitar. After messing around on the guitar for a while, he eventually moved on to the piano. In his early teens, the first record he ever bought was Honky Chateau by Elton John, and he became obsessed with the musician, using his music as inspiration for his own work. He even wanted to be Elton John himself, saying the job of a musician seemed wonderful. Not just Elton John, he was really influenced by tons of unsuspecting bands and musicians, like the Beatles, Pink Floyd, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, Stevie Wonder, and so many more. He really loved progressive rock, and I'm pretty shocked at his musical tastes. I would have never guessed any of these based on his Final Fantasy music. He explained that in this progressive rock movement, they started introducing things like orchestration, which also got him into discovering the world of classical music. Nobuo's father didn't think of music as a career, so he went to normal college instead of music school at Kanagawa University, where he would meet his future wife, Reiko. He'd graduate with a degree in English in 1981. In his early 20s, he took up playing keyboard in several amateur rock bands, writing music for over 100 songs. It was at this time he discovered his talent for writing music. In the early days of his career, he composed music for commercials, although I can't seem to find any information about this other than some brief mentions of it online. And I found out one other thing. His first paid gig was doing music for a porno flick. The studio this was produced for was Nikatsu Roman Porno, but that's all that's known. There's actually a whole Wikipedia page on that studio, and it has the whole list of films that they produced, I guess. And some of these names are just hilarious. You should go take a look. Later on in his mid-20s, he was working at a music rental shop in Tokyo. Nobuo really wanted to work in the music industry, but with no connections and no formal training, this seemed like an impossible task. Uematsu and some of his friends would have nightly get-togethers at his home, where people would gather to drink and discuss their dreams, usually in the creative field. A friend in the group said she got a job in the art department of a game company, and having known of Nobuo's talents, it was not before long she would ask him to produce music for the small game studio. He was really in need of some extra money as he planned on getting married soon to Reiko, and thought she wouldn't marry him unless he had a stable income. He accepted, and his friend took him to Square, a newly formed game studio working from a computer cafe. He'd work on several game soundtracks that are now obscure. The first game he worked on was Cruise Chaser Blasty. And I didn't know just how many games Square was pumping out back then, mostly unsuccessful games with the occasional okay game like Rad Racer. He composed for over 10 games throughout 86 and 87 when Square started to face bankruptcy. One day, one of Nobuo's friends in his drinking group foretold his future for him. He revealed that next week, his life was about to change and that the name Nobuo Uematsu would be known around the world. Meanwhile at Square, a man by the name of Hironobu Sakaguchi, one of Square's first employees, convinced the studio to let him create an RPG after seeing the success of Enix's Dragon Quest game. By the way, in case anyone out there doesn't know this already, Square and Enix used to be separate companies. Sakaguchi was aggressively trying to recruit talent for his project, and in a chance encounter, he would cross paths with Uematsu and asked if he'd like to compose for his new game called Final Fantasy. And of course, this all happened a week after his friend told him his fortune. While working on the first Final Fantasy, he focused on heartfelt melodies, inspired in part by Super Mario Bros. And Dragon Quest. Initially, Nobuo didn't see this whole thing as a real job, since composing for video games wasn't really a thing back then. It was more of a side gig to him, and he thought he'd do it for a couple of years until he could compose for something more mature like film. But once Final Fantasy launched in 1987 and did so well that it saved the company, this side gig would turn into a full-time position for Uematsu for the next 18 years. And I just want to say that this is truly a story in making connections, as he went from having no formal training to knowing a friend who worked at a company, who got him a job at that company, and now he gets to do the thing that he didn't even study for. Well, at least not formally in a classroom.
It's not what you know, but who you know, you know?
Poetically, the very first track Nobuo worked on for Final Fantasy was the main theme of the franchise. He actually likes to tackle the main theme first, as it sets the tone for the rest of the music. Although at that time when he wrote the main theme of the franchise, it wasn't meant to be used in that way. Instead, it was just meant to be the main theme of the first game. But the staff really liked it, and they recycled the theme for Final Fantasy III. And from that point on, they just decided to make it into the main theme for Final Fantasy. The track did not feel complete to him until Final Fantasy VIII, since he had more sounds to compose with. Uematsu has gone on to say, "The theme from Final Fantasy is basically the song I'd like to be remembered by. I think it's very soft and warm, but there's a strength to it. It's appealing, and I think it's the most important song in terms of everything I've ever done." After finishing his work on the first Final Fantasy, Sakaguchi came into the room and asked for one final song for the opening screen. He gave Nobuo 30 minutes to write this final piece of music, which ended up being Prelude, a song that is still regularly used in the franchise to this day. Even though he was given 30 minutes, he wrote it in less than 10. He said that programming music for the NES was very difficult, as he would have to type out every note. But he has also said that programming with the limitations of the NES and the SNES was quite enjoyable. He said, "I think that the more limited people are, the more ingenious they begin to get, so maybe I actually enjoy thinking about how I could make rock music with just 3 sounds, or how I could make classical sounding music. It was like a game to me." At the time of Final Fantasy II, the famous hummable tune of the Chocobo theme was introduced. Uematsu said that this is the song he's most surprised by the success of. As well as the fanfare music, he's really shocked at how easily fans recognize that short little song. Interestingly, Nobuo didn't like making battle themes, despite having created some of the best and most memorable battle themes in gaming. I guess it's from his peaceful background on Shikoku, but he says he prefers creating love themes or magnificent main themes. Once Final Fantasy moved on from the NES to the SNES, a lot changed with the music. Aside from having more than twice as many sounds to work with, from 3 to 8, the thing Nobuo enjoyed the most was being able to incorporate drum sounds. He's gone on to say that he can no longer listen to his music from his old NES days, as he gets embarrassed at how crude those old songs were due to his inexperience. But he says he's fine with the orchestral versions of his work, as they've been rearranged and fixed up. And speaking of orchestras, the first time he heard his music in orchestral form was in the late 80s to a small audience. Although he was happy to hear his music performed, he was also very afraid. Never having any formal music training made him very self-conscious of his work, especially when he was in a setting of about 80 people who had all been studying music since childhood. Nobuo says that he has never gotten over his inferiority complex. When his music is performed live, he still thinks about how those people have studied music for decades, and he just can't compare. The first instance of his music being performed outside of Japan wouldn't happen until 2003 in Germany. This was actually the first video game concert outside of Japan. The first video game concert ever was actually for their competitor Enix's Dragon Quest game in 1987. And then the year after that, the music of Final Fantasy would make its way to the United States at the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. The concert would sell out in one day, much to the surprise of Uematsu. He says that audiences abroad seem to express their joy with the music better, as they respond with cheers and it makes him feel happy. Sakaguchi was initially very specific about the music for the first couple games, but after proving he knew what he was doing, Uematsu would later just receive a storyline and a theme for the game. The theme for Final Fantasy VII was Inochi, a Japanese term for life or life energy. With the advancements of the PlayStation hardware came the possibility to include vocals in the music. While Uematsu tried this out initially, using all that audio data made the loading screens longer, which brought everything to a halt, including the music. He didn't like this feeling of waiting, so to circumvent this, he had the music of FF7 stored into the internal memory so that it didn't stop during loading screens. However, this would come at the cost of lower audio quality. He compared Final Fantasy VII's soundtrack to another game at the time, and was jealous of the fidelity of the other game's music, so he ditched this approach for Final Fantasy VIII, which ended up having a much higher quality soundtrack. The opening theme for Final Fantasy VII was actually the first piece of music he produced for the game. They gave him the cinematic and he got to work. Once the piece of music was complete, Hironobu Sakaguchi returned to Japan from a business trip to Hawaii, and he went over to Nobuo to listen to the song he produced. After listening to the opening theme, all Sakaguchi had to say was, "Very good," and he left. Yeah, that's all he said. And even though Sakaguchi didn't really give him much approval, Uematsu was confident in his soundtrack for Final Fantasy VII since it had such a different feel from previous entries. Speaking of the opening, remember that disappointing PS3 tech demo? Well, the music there was not scored by Uematsu. Maybe that's obvious, but in case you were wondering, there you go. But while on the topic of the tech demo, in an interview over a decade old, Nobuo was asked how he'd feel about a remake. He said that if it stayed exactly the same, and if he could remake his music with modern tech, he would love it, but says he wouldn't like scoring it if they changed the story at all, since it would feel wrong to change his work around and put music in different places with new scenes. Now, before we get ahead of ourselves talking about the remake, let's talk about One Winged Angel. It's arguably the series' most iconic battle theme and was composed in an experimental way. Uematsu was thinking how he could write a piece for an orchestra while having the same destructive impact as rock music. He was heavily inspired by Stravinsky's Rite of Spring and Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze. Every morning, he'd wake up and write 2 to 4 measures that popped into his mind while having the image of Sephiroth in his head. After a couple weeks of doing this, he had a collection of 20 to 30 measures which he then rearranged into the famous masterpiece we all know today. Even though this unorthodox method created one of the best pieces for the franchise, he would never use it again. One Winged Angel was also the most time-consuming song he's ever written for the series. He never really spent long writing any of those original pieces we all know and love, typically only taking about 15 minutes to maybe a week. Once the game released, it ended up being the most expensive video game ever produced, and it's still one of the most expensive games ever. $45 million for the game and an additional $100 million for marketing. Funny enough, the remake also cost about the same as the original, about $144 million. But adjusted for inflation, Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation 1 still beats the remake, costing about $230 million as opposed to the $144 million of the remake. Nevertheless, both versions became profitable within a week of their release. Now let's jump ahead to the remake. I know this is out of order, but it makes sense to put it here, so bear with me. When Final Fantasy VII Remake was announced, I literally jumped with excitement. It's probably the most excited I'd ever been for anything, as sad as that is. I actually remember being in the basement watching E3 instead of watching the Stanley Cup Blackhawks game with my family upstairs. But I didn't care. I was happier than any Chicagoan could have been that night, but for an entirely different reason.
Chicago Blackhawks are Stanley Cup champions!
And imagine my excitement when they announced that Nobuo was returning to compose for the game. The remake came out and the music was some of the best in the franchise in a very long time. I praise Nobuo Uematsu's work. And that was kind of the point to making this video, until I was crushed to realize that Nobuo didn't compose music for Remake. This is definitely common knowledge for the rest of you, but for some reason this slipped by me. I mean, if you go on Spotify and listen to the Remake soundtrack, most of the tracks are credited to Nobuo Uematsu, but that's only because they're his original scores. The real composers for Remake were Mitsuo Suzuki, an avid fan of Final Fantasy VII growing up, and who worked on the Dissidia series, 13, and more. The other composer was Masashi Hamauzu. He actually worked on the original Final Fantasy VII, getting together the chorus and singing in it for One Winged Angel, as well as recreating Hayden's The Creation for this very small scene. Random, but neat nonetheless. He'd also work on Final Fantasy X and the 13 series alongside Mitsuo. Hamauzu retired from Square Enix a long time ago, but when Remake was being developed, Uematsu recommended him for the project since he liked Hamauzu's strong feelings to develop his own style. Although he had grown tired of working on games, there was no way he could turn down the offer. The only song that Uematsu contributed to the remake was Hollow, the main theme song that plays at the end. And this will most likely be the case for Rebirth, with the new song No Promises to Keep being the only song he contributes. Sometime in the early 2000s, Nobuo started composing for animes as well, contributing some theme songs and other compositions for Oh My Goddess and Final Fantasy Unlimited. The first time Final Fantasy's music evolved from electronic sounds was in Final Fantasy VIII. This was the first time Nobuo was able to record a live orchestra for the opening and ending themes of the game. These two themes would also make their way to the Olympics in 2004, being used by two United States swimmers performing an artistic swimming routine. When creating the soundtrack for Final Fantasy IX, Nobuo went to Europe on a 2-week vacation to visit European castles for inspiration. He would be the sole composer for the first 9 mainline games, until he was assisted by Masashi Hamauzu and Junya Nakano for Final Fantasy X. Nobuo composed 51 tracks with Masashi contributing 20 and Junya 18. The two composers were chosen based on their abilities to create music which sounded different from what Uematsu produced. The fact that the PlayStation 2 now offered voice acting really changed the team's approach to music, as now Uematsu was focusing on a more subdued cinematic approach. The famous song of Final Fantasy X, To Xanarkand, was initially written for a friend of Uematsu who needed a flute song to play for a recital. But since it was too somber for what his friend needed, he ended up repurposing it for Final Fantasy X as a piano arrangement, which was actually a first for the series. In 2000, fellow Square composers Kenichiro Fukui and Tsuyoshi Sekito partnered up to compose rock music for the game All-Star Pro Wrestling. After the game's success, they continued composing in the rock style. Later in 2002, they arranged some music from Final Fantasy. Being a fan of rock music, Nobuo liked these arrangements a lot. Kenichiro and Tsuyoshi would ask him to join them and start a rock band together. Although initially declining, he eventually agreed to do one live performance with them as a keyboardist. He fell in love with the atmosphere and the excitement of the experience, so he agreed to start a band with them. The name, The Black Mages, was chosen by another Square employee. The band would eventually grow with more members and found moderate success, releasing 3 studio albums and doing live performances. Most notably, they helped produce music for the 2005 Final Fantasy film Advent Children. Hang on, I noticed something while looking at this roster, and that's the name of Keiji Kawamori, who was actually the music supervisor for Final Fantasy VII Remake. Later on in the band's career, several members wanted to start doing original music, but seeing as how this was a side project and the members had jobs and didn't have much time, they disbanded in 2010. Another reason they disbanded was due to the nature of their band. You see, Square Enix basically owned them and their name, so those desires of branching out to more original music weren't really possible. In an interview I read, they mentioned using the Black Mages initials, TBM, and changing the name of the band to something like Tokyo Businessmen, which to me has the same ironic dull tone as Square Enix's creative business unit. The eventual successor to the band would be Earthbound Papas, which also covers Final Fantasy music, but they do original music as well. The first song they performed live was a dream rock orchestral rendition of Dancing Mad. Remember that awful Final Fantasy movie, The Spirits Within? Well, over dinner and some drinks, Sakaguchi asked Uematsu to create the main theme for the movie. But not knowing if he was being serious or if he was just drunk, he never made the song. But after the movie was finished, Sakaguchi told him, "You know, you never wrote that piece for me." In 2004, Uematsu and, now Square Enix, parted ways. The main driving force for this was Square Enix switching offices after a fortune teller told them to do so. They moved their Meguro office to Shinjuku to bring good fortune. The commute would be over an hour for Uematsu, and he didn't like the Shinjuku area anyway. Also, after some drama in the company following the disaster of the Spirits Within movie, fellow Square friend Hironobu Sakaguchi had already departed from the company by this point. The time just felt right for Uematsu to leave and take on the next step of his career. The last game he'd work on as a Square Enix employee was Final Fantasy XI. After his departure, he created his own personal studio, Smile Please, with his wife Reiko, as well as a music production company, Dog Ear Records. Creating his own business allowed him to have more time to himself, but that quickly changed as he would be inundated with offers. One of those offers would be his old friend Hironobu Sakaguchi and his new game company, Mistwalker. Nobuo would continue working with Hironobu for years to come, working on games like Blue Dragon and Lost Odyssey. Unlike Sakaguchi, however, Uematsu still worked with Square Enix and did some freelance work for them after his departure. After Final Fantasy XI, he contributed Final Fantasy XII's ending theme, Kiss Me Goodbye, and the main theme for 13 was announced to be produced by Uematsu, but after taking on composing for 14, he gave 13's main theme to Masashi Hamauzu. Speaking of 14, he scored the entire soundtrack for its initial release, although he didn't feel very nostalgic towards this entry as it was an MMO, unlike the single-player narratives of the past. After leaving Square Enix, he did a number of other things, like score his first full soundtrack in an anime for Guin Saga, which he got to compose after the show producer heard his Lost Odyssey music. And probably Nobuo's most famous work outside of Final Fantasy was creating the Smash Bros. Brawl theme. Alright, and now just some personal facts about his life and some fun facts to wrap it up. Nobuo is a simple man. He resides in Tokyo with his wife Reiko and has a summer cabin in Yamanakako, Yamanashi. By the way, if you're wondering, no, he doesn't have any children. Nobuo loves beer and even brewing his own beer. His favorite American beer is Samuel Adams. He also loves watching pro wrestling. On top of wanting to be a musician, he initially wanted to be a pro wrestler, but standing at just 5 feet 6 inches, he said he was much too small, but said he maybe would have had a better chance if he moved to Mexico. You may have noticed that Nobuo has a pretty sweet mustache. Well, there's actually a story behind this. During the time of Final Fantasy III, Sakaguchi asked Uematsu if he should grow a mustache. Uematsu said yes, and Sakaguchi said to grow one with him. Nobuo actually needed to appear older anyway, since around this time they had just hired 2 new sound programmers, and being only in his early 30s, Nobuo thought he'd grow one to appear more authoritative. Both men grew their mustaches together and still have them to this day. You know, I had no idea that he and Sakaguchi were so close. It's really cute. Aside from getting to compose for Final Fantasy, he also got a lifelong friend in the process. And on top of composing for Final Fantasy, Nobuo also helped create music for Chrono Trigger, another game Sakaguchi had been working on in the mid-90s. Although not initially involved with the project, when composer Yasunori Mitsuda worked so hard that he developed stomach ulcers, Sakaguchi asked Uematsu to step in to complete his work. He provided 10 of the 64 tracks. The music of Final Fantasy made its way to the Stephen Colbert Show, with musician Jean-Baptiste performing his favorite Final Fantasy songs for the crowd and millions of viewers, his favorite video game soundtrack being Final Fantasy VII. Nobuo surprisingly remembers the first song he ever wrote and included it in this children's music CD from 2010 for his 50th birthday. Now, I heard him talk about this twice, and both times he didn't say which song from the soundtrack is his first. He wrote the song when he was 12 and based the entire album off of that song. The majority of the songs from the album are actually available on the Dog Ear Records YouTube channel. I'll leave a link to it in the description in case you want to check it out. The Classic FM Hall of Fame, which is the largest poll for classical music, holds a yearly countdown of the top 300 classical pieces of music. Back in 2012, Aerith's theme made its way onto the list at number 16. It was the first time a video game soundtrack had made it onto the list. And then the year after, in 2013, Aerith's theme was voted onto the list yet again. This time it made its way to the number 3 spot, to the dismay of a lot of classical enthusiasts. The comments are pretty entertaining to read. They mostly say that it isn't classical music and that people aren't educated about what classical music really is. And look, I get it, but also it's a public list, so of course popular music is gonna make its way on there. I mean, Sewell from Skyrim made its way onto the list that year at number 5, beating out Beethoven. And if you look at it now, there's so many game and movie soundtracks as well. I'm sure Nobuo was happy to see Aerith's theme on there, since it's his favorite from Final Fantasy VII. One thing I wasn't expecting was for Nobuo to play the games himself. I'm not sure why, but I didn't think it would be his thing. But yes, Nobuo Uematsu has played all the games that he has composed for. I got this from a 2009 interview, but he says that he played all games up until Final Fantasy XI. That makes me wonder if he's played any of the more modern games. He says that Final Fantasy VI was his favorite to play, but also his favorite to work on, as it had the most passion behind it, before the series and company started to get a little bit more corporate. And just to mention it while we're talking about 6, he says that Terra's theme was actually his favorite track. By the way, just a disclaimer, when I say this or that is his favorite, it's based on just one or several accounts. His answers definitely change with time. So I'm sure there's been other times where he says other things, but this is based on what he said at one point or another. Although most fans may think that the Final Fantasy VII soundtrack is the most popular, they'd technically be wrong. In November 1999, Guinness recognized Final Fantasy VIII as the best-selling video game soundtrack of all time, selling 300,000 copies in 9 months in Japan alone. But to be honest, it was difficult to find any more information on sales numbers for each soundtrack. However, I did find this one table that clearly shows Final Fantasy VIII beating Final Fantasy VII, but the numbers given by this table and Guinness don't really match up. Although it wouldn't be hard to see why Final Fantasy VIII would sell better, as it was the first time there was a live orchestra and the first time a pop song was used with Eyes on Me, performed by Faye Wong. When asked in a Q&A, Nobuo said that his favorite music for another series is Professor Layton. Earlier, we took a look at all the rock bands that Nobuo was inspired by, but out of all of those, his favorite rock band is the Beatles. The last game Nobuo fully composed for was Fantasian in 2021, an Apple Arcade exclusive created by, you guessed it, Hironobu Sakaguchi. This game might also be his last due to health concerns. You see, in 2018, Uematsu took an extended leave of absence due to work fatigue from wrapping up a hectic touring schedule. He worked so hard that he was hospitalized and was apparently close to death. Sakaguchi had doubts that he would be able to work on Fantasian, but after recovering, he went on to produce all 60 tracks for the game. It was very experimental and he says it's some of his best work. However, these health concerns really impacted multiple aspects of his life, including his mood. He had been confident in his health, but says not so much anymore. Although he says this might be his last game to fully compose, he did oversee all the compositions for Final Fantasy Pixel remasters. He also composed on recently released Grand Blue Fantasy, and is a guest composer on an upcoming game called Penny Blood, a Shadow Hearts style game. I think I can speak for everyone when I say that I really hope he continues to stay healthy and that we get to keep hearing more of his amazing music. He really is a gem in the industry, and we all as fans owe it to him for making the experience of Final Fantasy that much more meaningful. With his head-rocking battle themes to his tear-jerking melodies, thank you Mr. Uematsu for everything you've contributed to gaming. And that does it for this episode of Culture Explained. If you made it this far, please consider subscribing. I'm a new channel that likes covering the stories of artists and creators and their illustrious careers. I try covering a wide range of topics to keep things fresh, but this isn't the last time I cover Final Fantasy, nor is it the last time I cover something video game related. So stick around, I might just end up covering one of your favorite creators who you'd like to know more about. If I missed anything important that you think I should have included in this video, please let me know in the comments below, and I'll try covering it in a YouTube short. Alright everyone, remember to stay cultured, and I'll see you all next time.